The stranger collapsed in the snow 3 feet from Logan Vale's cabin door, and for the first time in 5 years, he found himself wanting to speak. He had been checking his trap lines when he spotted the figure stumbling through the drifts, dark against the white expanse of the Colorado mountains. From a distance, he had assumed it was a man, maybe a prospector who had wandered too far from the mining camps near Ordway. But as he approached the crumpled form now lying unconscious on his doorstep, he realized his mistake. It was a woman. Logan stood frozen, his massive frame casting a long shadow across her still body. His breath created small clouds in the frigid February air of 1883. He had not been this close to another human being in half a decade. His muscles tensed beneath his heavy fur coat, and his calloused hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Everything in him wanted to turn away, to pretend he had not seen her, to let the mountain decide her fate as it had decided so many things for him. But he could not. With a grunt that seemed to scrape against his throat like rusted metal, Logan bent down and scooped the woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and even through the layers of inadequate clothing she wore, he could feel how cold she had become. Her lips were blue, her face pale as the snow itself. Dark hair spilled from beneath a threadbare bonnet, and he noticed that her coat was torn at the shoulder, exposing fabric that looked more suitable for a spring day in town than a winter in the high country. He kicked open his cabin door and carried her inside, laying her carefully on the bearskin rug in front of his fireplace. The cabin was warm, kept heated by a fire he maintained with the dedication of a man who had nothing but time. Logan moved with practiced efficiency, building up the flames and then turning his attention to the woman. His hands shook slightly as he began to remove her wet outer garments. It had been so long since he had touched another person. The intimacy of the act, even under these desperate circumstances, made something twist in his chest. He worked quickly, his face burning despite the cold that still clung to her clothes. Beneath the poor excuse for a winter coat, she wore a simple calico dress soaked through with melted snow. He hesitated, then grabbed one of his own flannel shirts from a peg on the wall and several thick wool blankets. Turning his back to give her what privacy he could manage while she was unconscious, Logan helped her out of the wet dress and into his shirt, which hung on her like a tent. He wrapped her in the blankets and positioned her closer to the fire, then set water to heat on the stove. His movements were efficient, but his mind raced with questions he could not answer and would not ask even if she woke. Who was she? What was she doing this far up the mountain? Where had she come from? Logan ran a hand through his long, dark hair and across the thick beard that covered the lower half of his face. He caught his reflection in the small, cracked mirror that hung near the door. He barely recognized himself anymore. The man staring back at him had wild eyes and looked more animal than human. His shoulders were broader than they had been 5 years ago, built up from chopping wood and hauling water and surviving alone in one of the harshest environments in Colorado. His arms were thick with muscle, his chest wide and solid beneath the layers of clothing he wore. He was 32 years old, and he had not spoken a single word since the day he climbed this mountain and decided never to come down. The woman stirred, a small sound escaping her lips. Logan watched from across the room, keeping his distance like a wolf that had forgotten how to be tame. Her eyelids fluttered, and then suddenly she was awake, her eyes snapping open with a gasp. They were green, he noticed, the color of spring grass, of life, of everything this mountain was not in the dead of winter. She looked around wildly, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. When her gaze landed on Logan, she froze. He could see the fear bloom across her features as she took in his size, his appearance, the isolation of the cabin. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her she was safe, but the words would not come. They stuck in his throat like stones, and even if he could have formed them, he was not sure he would remember how to make his mouth-shaped sounds that meant anything. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and shaking. "Where am I?" Logan just stared at her, his jaw working uselessly. The silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward. He saw the fear in her eyes intensify, and something in him ached at that. Finally, he moved slowly to the stove, poured hot water into a tin cup, and brought it to her, setting it on the floor within her reach before backing away again. She watched him with wide eyes, then carefully reached for the cup, pulling it close to her chest as if it were something precious. She took a small sip, then another, and some of the color began to return to her cheeks. "Thank you," she said quietly. Logan nodded once, sharp and quick, then turned back to the stove. He busied himself making stew from dried venison and the vegetables he had stored in his root cellar. He could feel her watching him, could sense the questions building behind those green eyes, but he kept his back to her and focused on the simple, familiar task of cooking. "My name is Margaret Owens," she said after a long while. "I was traveling to Ordway with a wagon train, but I got separated during the storm yesterday. I thought I saw smoke from a chimney, so I followed it. I must have walked all night." She paused, and he heard the tremor in her voice. "I thought I was going to die out there." Logan's hands stilled over the pot. He had saved her life. The realization settled over him like a weight. She was alive because of him, because he had been checking his traps at exactly the right moment, because some part of him that he thought had died years ago had refused to let her freeze 3 feet from his door. "Can you speak?" Margaret asked, and there was no judgment in her voice, only gentle curiosity. Logan turned to look at her. She had pulled the blankets up to her chin and was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. He opened his mouth, tried to form words, but nothing came out except a rough, painful sound that was not quite a word and not quite just air. He closed his mouth again, frustration and something like shame burning in his chest, and shook his head. "That is all right," Margaret said softly. "You do not have to talk. You saved my life. That is more than enough." Something in Logan's chest loosened at her words. He nodded again and went back to the stew. They sat in silence, but it felt different now, less hostile, less charged with fear. He served her a bowl of stew, and she ate it gratefully, her hands still shaking slightly from the cold that was slowly leaving her bones. As night fell outside the cabin windows, Logan realized he had a problem. He only had one bed, a narrow cot built into the wall of the cabin. He looked from the bed to Margaret and back again, trying to figure out how to communicate his dilemma. Margaret seemed to understand. "I can sleep here by the fire," she said, gesturing to the bearskin rug where she still sat wrapped in blankets. "I have imposed on you enough already." Logan shook his head firmly. He pointed to the bed, then to her, then to himself and the floor. His meaning was clear. "I cannot take your bed," Margaret protested. "This is your home. You have already done so much." But Logan was already gathering more blankets and furs, making himself a place on the floor near the door. He was used to sleeping on the ground, had done it often enough when checking distant trap lines. The floor of his cabin would be a luxury compared to some of the places he had spent the night over the past 5 years. Margaret watched him for a long moment, then sighed. "You are very stubborn, aren't you?" Logan's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. It felt strange on his face, like a muscle he had forgotten he had. That night, Logan lay awake long after he heard Margaret's breathing even out into sleep. The cabin felt different with another person in it. The air moved differently, smelled different. He could hear the small sounds she made in her sleep, the rustle of blankets, the soft sighs. It was unsettling and comforting all at once. He thought about the last time he had shared space with another human being. It had been down in Ordway, in the small room behind the church where he had lived when he was still Reverend Logan Vale, still a man who believed in words and their power to heal, to save, to make sense of a senseless world. That belief had died along with Caroline. Logan squeezed his eyes shut against the memory, but it came anyway, as fresh and sharp as it had been 5 years ago. Caroline, his wife of 3 years, lying in their bed with the fever ravaging her body. The doctor had said there was nothing to be done, that it was in God's hands now. Logan had prayed. He had prayed with every ounce of faith he possessed, had begged God to spare her, to take him instead, to do anything but let her die. His prayers had not been answered. Caroline had died on a Tuesday morning in April, with the spring flowers blooming outside their window and the sound of children playing in the street. She had died, and Logan's faith had died with her. Every word he had ever spoken from the pulpit, every sermon, every prayer, every piece of comfort he had offered to his congregation suddenly felt like lies. What good were words if they could not save the person you loved most in the world? He had stopped speaking that day, had packed a bag, walked away from the church, away from Ordway, away from everything, and climbed into these mountains. He had found this abandoned cabin, repaired it, and made it his home, and he had not spoken to another living soul since, until now. Logan opened his eyes and stared at the dark ceiling. Margaret Owens had crashed into his life like an avalanche, unexpected and devastating. He did not want her here. He did not want to remember what it felt like to be responsible for another person, to care whether someone lived or died. But she was here, and he could not change that, not until the weather cleared enough for her to travel safely. The storm continued for 3 more days. During that time, Logan and Margaret developed a strange sort of rhythm. She would wake in the mornings to find him already up, the fire built high, coffee brewing on the stove. He always left the cabin after breakfast, checking his traps and giving her privacy to wash and dress. She was wearing his clothes, his shirts, and a pair of his pants that she had to roll up at the ankles and cinch tight at the waist with a belt. On someone else it might have looked ridiculous, but on Margaret it just looked practical. When he returned, usually around midday, she would have tidied the cabin and prepared something for lunch with the supplies he had stored. Logan was surprised by this, by her willingness to make herself useful, to contribute to the space even though she was his guest. Most women of his acquaintance, back when he had acquaintances, would have sat primly and waited to be served. But Margaret was different. She talked while she worked, filling the cabin with words that Logan had not heard in years. She told him about her life in Kansas, about the farm where she had grown up, about her parents who had died the previous winter of influenza. She talked about her decision to head west, to start over in Colorado, where she had a distant cousin who had promised her work in a boarding house in Ordway. "I know it must seem foolish," she said one afternoon, as she kneaded bread dough on his rough-hewn table. "A woman traveling alone like that. But I could not stay in Kansas anymore. Everything there reminded me of them, of my parents. I needed to go somewhere new, somewhere I could breathe again." Logan understood that more than she knew. He watched her work the dough, her small hands strong and capable. She had calluses on her palms, he noticed, the hands of someone who was not afraid of hard work. "Do you miss it?" she asked suddenly, looking up at him. "Talking, I mean?" The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that before. But then again, no one had been around to ask. Logan considered it carefully. Did he miss it? He remembered how words had once felt in his mouth, how he had wielded them like tools, shaping sermons and prayers and conversations. But he also remembered how hollow they had felt at the end, how useless. He shrugged, a non-committal gesture that could have meant anything. Margaret studied him for a long moment, her green eyes thoughtful. "I think you must have been someone important before," she said quietly. "Someone who spoke a lot. Otherwise, the silence would not feel so deliberate." Logan felt his breath catch. She was too perceptive, this woman who had stumbled into his life. He turned away, busying himself with adding wood to the fire, even though it did not need it. "I am sorry," Margaret said behind him. "I did not mean to pry. It is just that I have always believed you can tell a lot about a person by the way they are silent, and your silence feels like it has weight to it, like it means something." It did mean something. It meant that he had failed. It meant that words were empty and useless, and he wanted nothing more to do with them. But Logan could not tell her that, could not explain the depths of his anger and grief and shame, so he just stood with his back to her and gripped the poker so hard his knuckles turned white. "It is all right," Margaret said softly. "You do not have to explain. We all have our reasons for the things we do." That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Margaret began to sing. It started soft and tentative, as if she was not sure it was allowed in this space of deliberate silence. But when Logan did not stop her, her voice grew stronger, filling the cabin with a melody he vaguely recognized as a hymn. The sound pierced something in his chest. He had not heard music in 5 years, had not realized how much he missed it until this moment. Margaret's voice was not professionally trained, but it was sweet and clear, and it carried emotions that words alone could not capture. Joy and sorrow and hope all woven together in the notes. When she finished, the silence that followed felt different than the silence before. Logan found himself looking at her, really looking at her for the first time since she had arrived. She was pretty, he realized, not in the flashy way that some women tried to be, with elaborate hairstyles and fancy clothes, but in a natural, honest way. Her dark hair fell in simple waves around her face, and her features were soft and kind. She had a sprinkling of freckles across her nose, and her mouth curved upward, even in repose, as if she was always on the verge of smiling. She caught him staring and did smile then, a full, warm smile that made something in his chest ache. "Would you like me to sing another one?" she asked. Logan nodded, perhaps too eagerly. So she sang again, and then again, and the cabin that had been filled with only the sounds of wind and fire and the occasional grunt from Logan for 5 long years suddenly became a place of music. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Logan woke to see sunshine streaming through the cabin window, bright and clear. The snow had stopped falling, and though the drifts were high, the sky was a brilliant blue. Margaret saw it too. "The weather has cleared," she said, and there was something in her voice that Logan could not quite identify. Relief? Regret? Perhaps both. Logan nodded. He should have felt relieved as well. His isolation could return, his silence could remain unbroken. But instead, he felt something heavy settle in his stomach. After breakfast, he went outside to assess the situation. The snow was deep, too deep for Margaret to travel alone, but he could break a trail down the mountain. It would take most of the day, but he could get her to Ordway by nightfall. He should do it today while the weather held. It was the right thing to do, the responsible thing. When he came back inside, Margaret was packing the few things she had. Her original dress had dried, and she had folded it carefully. She looked up when he entered, and their eyes met across the small cabin. "I suppose it is time for me to go," she said quietly. Logan wanted to argue, wanted to tell her to stay, but the words were not there, and would not come even if he tried to find them. So he just nodded and began gathering supplies for the journey. Extra blankets, food for the trip, his rifle in case they encountered wolves or worse. They set out within the hour. Logan went first, his powerful legs breaking through the deep snow to create a path that Margaret could follow. It was hard work, even for someone as strong as he was, but he kept a steady pace. Behind him, he could hear Margaret's labored breathing as she struggled to keep up. When they stopped to rest, Logan handed her dried meat and water. She took it gratefully, her cheeks flushed from the exertion and the cold. "Thank you," she said, not for the first time. "For everything. You saved my life, gave me shelter, and now you are taking me to safety. I do not know how I will ever repay you." Logan shook his head. He did not want repayment. He wanted her to be safe, wanted her to have the life she had come to Colorado to find. That was enough. "Will you be all right up here alone?" Margaret asked suddenly. "In the mountains, I mean. It must be terribly lonely." Logan felt his jaw tighten. It was lonely. It had always been lonely, but lonely was safe. Lonely meant no one could disappoint you or leave you or die and take your whole world with them. "I worry about you," Margaret continued, her green eyes serious. "I know we have only known each other a few days, but I cannot help it. You have been kind to me, kinder than you needed to be. And I think there is a good man underneath all that silence and solitude. A man who is hurting." Logan looked away, uncomfortable with how clearly she saw him. He stood abruptly and gestured toward the trail ahead. They needed to keep moving. The sun was beginning to set by the time they reached the outskirts of Ordway. The town had grown since Logan had last seen it 5 years ago. There were more buildings, more people, more of everything that he had left behind. He stopped at the edge of town, unwilling to go further. Margaret seemed to understand. "This is far enough," she said. "I can find my way from here." She turned to face him, and Logan was struck again by how small she was, how delicate she looked in his oversized clothes. She reached up, and before he could stop her, placed her hand against his bearded cheek. "Thank you, Logan Vale," she said softly. He jerked back in surprise. She knew his name. How did she know his name? Margaret smiled sadly. "I found your Bible," she explained, "the one with your name inscribed in the front, Reverend Logan Vale. I put it together after that. The church in Ordway used to have a reverend by that name, but he disappeared 5 years ago after his wife died. People still talk about it sometimes, wonder what happened to him." Logan felt exposed, raw, like she had stripped away a protective layer he had built around himself. His breathing came faster, and he took a step back from her. "I will not tell anyone," Margaret said quickly. "Your secret is safe with me. You have earned your solitude, whatever your reasons for choosing it. But Logan, please listen to me. Grief is a terrible thing, and it can swallow you whole if you let it. I know. I lost both my parents last year, and there were days I thought I would drown in the sadness, but life still has good things in it. Beautiful things, music and sunshine and the kindness of strangers. Do not let your grief steal all of that from you." Logan stood frozen, her words washing over him like water over stone. Part of him wanted to run, to retreat back up the mountain to his cabin and his silence. But another part of him, a part he thought had died with Caroline, wanted to reach out and hold on to this moment, onto this woman who saw him so clearly and had not turned away. Margaret stepped back, giving him space. "My cousin's boarding house is on Main Street," she said. "If you ever need anything, or if you just want to talk." She paused, then smiled. "Or not talk. If you ever want to not talk in the company of someone else, I will be there." Then she turned and walked away, his clothes still on her back, carrying nothing but the small bundle that held her dress. Logan watched her go, watched until she turned a corner and disappeared from view. Then he stood there a moment longer, staring at the town that used to be his home. Finally, as darkness fell completely, he turned and began the long walk back up the mountain. The cabin felt emptier than it ever had before. Logan went through his routines mechanically, building up the fire, preparing food, checking his supplies. But everything felt wrong. The silence that had been his companion, his choice, his refuge, now felt suffocating. He found himself looking at the spaces where Margaret had been, the rug where she had slept that first night, the chair where she had sat while sewing up the tear in his coat, the spot by the stove where she had stood while singing those hymns. Days passed, then weeks. Winter began to give way to early spring, and Logan continued his solitary existence. But something had changed. He caught himself humming sometimes, the tunes to the songs Margaret had sung. He found one of her hairpins on the floor and could not bring himself to throw it away, so he put it on the shelf with his few possessions. At night, he lay awake and thought about what she had said, about grief swallowing you whole, about life still having beautiful things in it, about not letting sorrow steal everything away. One morning in late March, Logan woke to the sound of birds singing. Spring was coming to the mountains, bringing with it new life and new possibilities. He stood outside his cabin and looked down toward where he knew Ordway lay, hidden beyond the ridges and valleys. He thought about Margaret Owens with her green eyes and her kindness and her music. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with fear or pity, but with understanding. He thought about how, for the first time in 5 years, his cabin had felt like a home instead of just a place to hide. Logan went back inside and looked at himself in the cracked mirror. The wild man stared back at him, all beard and long hair and haunted eyes. But maybe, just maybe, there was still something human underneath all that. He picked up the scissors he used for cutting leather and began to cut his hair. It was awkward and uneven, but he kept at it until it was shorter, more civilized. Then he heated water and found his old razor and began the slow, painful process of shaving his beard. He had not seen his own face in 5 years, and the man who emerged from beneath all that hair was both familiar and strange. Older, harder, marked by grief and isolation, but still recognizably Logan Vale. He washed thoroughly, put on his cleanest clothes, and packed a small bag. Then he locked the cabin door behind him and began walking down the mountain. It took him 2 days to reach Ordway, and with each step his heart beat faster. What if Margaret had forgotten him? What if she had moved on, found someone else, rebuilt her life without any space in it for a broken mountain man who had forgotten how to use his voice? What if he was too late? But he kept walking. Ordway looked different in the spring sunshine than it had that winter evening when he had left Margaret at its edge. The streets were busy with people going about their business, and Logan felt anxiety creep up his spine as he navigated through the crowds. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a wild animal that had been forced into town. He asked a shopkeeper for directions to the boarding house on Main Street, writing the question on a piece of paper he had brought for that purpose. The man gave him an odd look but pointed the way. The boarding house was a large, well-maintained building with a neat yard and curtains in the windows. Logan stood outside for a long moment, gathering his courage. Then he climbed the steps and knocked on the door. A middle-aged woman answered, looking at him with curiosity and a hint of suspicion. Logan pulled out another piece of paper on which he had written, "I am looking for Margaret Owens." The woman's expression softened. "Oh, you must be the mountain man," she said. "Margaret mentioned you might come by someday, though between you and me, I was starting to think she had imagined you. Wait here." She disappeared back into the house, and Logan waited, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Then he heard footsteps, light and quick, and suddenly Margaret was standing in the doorway. She looked different. Her hair was pinned up in a neat style, and she wore a simple but pretty dress in a soft blue color. But her eyes were the same, that impossible green, and when she saw him, they went wide with surprise and something else, something that looked like joy. "Logan," she breathed, and it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He nodded, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands, with his body, with any part of himself. "You came down from the mountain," Margaret said, and there were tears in her eyes now. "You came," Logan nodded again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, one he had labored over for hours the night before. On it, he had written, "You were right about grief, about not letting it steal everything. I want to try. Will you help me?" Margaret read the note, and the tears spilled over onto her cheeks. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, of course I will help you." And then she was stepping forward, closing the distance between them, and Logan found himself pulling her into his arms. She felt solid and real and alive, and he held her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. She wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest, and Logan felt something inside him crack open, something that had been frozen for 5 long years. "I am so glad you came," Margaret whispered against his shirt. "I have been hoping you would, but I was afraid to hope too much." Logan tightened his arms around her, trying to communicate through touch what he could not say with words. He was here. He had come. He was trying. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other on the front porch of the boarding house while the town moved around them. Finally, Margaret pulled back just enough to look up at him. "You shaved," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "I almost did not recognize you." Logan felt his own mouth curve up in response. It felt strange, smiling, but also good. "Right." "Come inside," Margaret said, taking his hand. "We have a lot to talk about. Or rather, I have a lot to talk about, and you can listen, and maybe someday, if you want to, you can talk too." She led him into the boarding house, and Logan went willingly, following her like a man who had been lost in the wilderness and had finally found his way home. Over the following weeks, Logan became a frequent visitor to the boarding house. Margaret had a small room on the 2nd floor, and the proprietor, a kind woman named Mrs. Henley, who turned out to be Margaret's cousin, allowed Logan to call on her in the sitting room. They spent hours together, Margaret talking and Logan listening. She told him about her work at the boarding house, the guests who came and went, the small dramas of life in town. She told him about her dreams for the future, about maybe opening her own small restaurant someday, serving the meals her mother had taught her to cook. And slowly, gradually, Logan began to communicate more. He wrote notes, at first short and simple, then longer and more detailed. He told her about his life on the mountain, about the rhythms of the seasons, about the animals he trapped and the solitude he had embraced. But he also told her about Caroline, about the grief that had driven him away from everything he had known. It was hard, putting those feelings into words even on paper. But Margaret never pushed, never demanded more than he could give. She just sat with him, holding his hand sometimes, offering her quiet presence as he worked through emotions he had buried for 5 years. One day in mid-April, as they sat in the boarding house garden where the first flowers were beginning to bloom, Margaret said, "Have you thought about trying to speak again? I mean, actually using your voice?" Logan had thought about it. The idea terrified him. What if he had forgotten how? What if the words came out wrong or not at all? What if he opened his mouth and all that came out was pain? "You do not have to," Margaret said quickly, seeing the fear in his eyes. "I just wondered. Your voice is still there, Logan. You have not lost it. You have just chosen not to use it. But maybe if you wanted to choose differently, you could." Logan pulled out his notebook and wrote, "I'm afraid." "I know," Margaret said softly, "but I'm here, and I promise, whatever happens, I will not judge you. I will not think less of you. I will just be here." Logan looked at her for a long moment, at this woman who had crashed into his life and changed everything. She was brave, he realized. So much braver than he was. She had lost her parents, had traveled across the country alone, had survived a blizzard and nearly freezing to death, and she was still open to life, still willing to hope and dream and sing. He wanted to be brave too. For her, but also for himself. Logan took a deep breath and opened his mouth. At first, nothing came out except a rasping sound that barely qualified as a noise. His throat felt tight, his tongue awkward and thick. But Margaret was watching him with such encouragement, such faith, that he tried again. Margaret, he managed, and his voice was rough and cracked and barely audible, but it was there. It was a word. Her name. Margaret's face broke into the most radiant smile he had ever seen, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, that is me. You said my name, Logan. You spoke." Logan felt something huge and overwhelming rise up in his chest. He had spoken. After 5 years of silence, he had used his voice, and the world had not ended. The words had not turned to ash in his mouth. He had said her name, and she had heard it, and everything was still okay. "Margaret," he said again, and it came easier this time. Still rough, still scratchy, but clearer. More certain. She reached over and took both his hands in hers, squeezing tight. "Keep going," she encouraged. "What else do you want to say?" Logan looked at her, at this miracle of a woman who had appeared in his life when he had needed her most, who had refused to let him hide in his grief, who had been patient and kind and impossibly good. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say to her, 1,000 feelings crowding his chest, but only 3 words made it past his lips. "I love you." His voice cracked on the last word, but it did not matter. He had said it. He had told her the truth that had been growing in his heart since the day he carried her into his cabin, and she had smiled at him like he was worth smiling at. Margaret went very still, her eyes searching his face. "Do you mean that?" she whispered. "Yes," Logan said, and this word came out stronger. "I love you, Margaret. I think I have loved you since you sang those hymns in my cabin, maybe even before that. I love you." "Oh, Logan," Margaret said, and then she was leaning forward, and Logan met her halfway, and they were kissing in the spring garden with the flowers blooming around them and the sun warm on their faces. It was Logan's first kiss in 5 years, and it felt like coming back to life. Margaret's lips were soft and sweet, and she tasted like the apple pie she had been baking earlier. He cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, gentle despite his strength, and kissed her like she was something precious and fragile and infinitely valuable. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Margaret was smiling so wide it looked like her face might split in half. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you since you gave me your bed and slept on the floor, since you carried me all the way down the mountain to keep me safe, since I saw the kindness in you that you tried so hard to hide. I love you, Logan Vale." Logan pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender soap and sunshine. "I do not deserve you," he said, the words muffled against her hair. "That is not true," Margaret said firmly, pulling back to look at him. "You deserve love and happiness just as much as anyone else. Your grief does not make you unworthy, Logan. It just makes you human." Over the next few months, Logan slowly reintegrated himself into the world. It was not easy. There were days when the urge to flee back to his mountain cabin was almost overwhelming, when the noise and bustle of town felt like too much, when words still got stuck in his throat. But Margaret was always there, patient and steady, helping him find his way. He started speaking more regularly, though he was still a man of few words. His voice remained rough around the edges, like he had swallowed gravel, but it grew stronger with use. He found that he did not want to preach anymore, did not want to stand in front of people and pretend he had answers to questions that had no answers. But he discovered that he did not mind talking to Margaret, sharing his thoughts and feelings in the quiet moments they had together. In June, Logan got a job helping to build a new church on the edge of town. The irony was not lost on him, but he found he enjoyed the physical work, using his considerable strength to raise walls and frame out windows. The pastor, a young man named Reverend Thomas, did not know about Logan's past, and Logan did not tell him. It was better that way. Margaret continued working at the boarding house, and in the evenings she and Logan would walk together through town or sit in the garden. She taught him how to laugh again, how to find joy in small things, and he taught her the names of the birds that sang in the mountains, told her stories about the wildlife he had observed during his years of solitude, shared parts of himself that he had thought were gone forever. In August, Logan built a small house on a piece of land just outside of Ordway. It was close enough to town that Margaret could easily get to her work, but far enough that Logan could have the quiet he still needed sometimes. It had a wide porch and big windows that let in lots of light, and a garden where Margaret immediately began planting vegetables and flowers. On a warm evening in September, as they sat on the porch of their new house watching the sunset, Logan turned to Margaret and said, "Marry me." It was not a question so much as a statement, a simple fact that he needed to speak out loud. They belonged together. He knew it with more certainty than he had known anything in years. Margaret's face lit up with that radiant smile he loved so much. "Yes," she said without hesitation, 1,000 times yes. They were married in October, in a simple ceremony at the new church Logan had helped build. Mrs. Henley was there, and a few of the other boarders, and Reverend Thomas performed the service. Logan spoke his vows clearly, his rough voice steady and sure as he promised to love and honor Margaret for the rest of his days. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Logan kissed Margaret with all the love and gratitude and hope that had been building in his heart. This woman had saved him, had pulled him out of the darkness and reminded him how to live. And now she was his wife, his partner, his home. Their first year of marriage was everything Logan had not dared to hope for. The house became a home, filled with Margaret's laughter and singing, with the smell of her cooking and the warmth of her presence. Logan continued his construction work and discovered he had a talent for it. He was good with his hands, good at seeing how things fit together, and he took pride in building sturdy, lasting structures. Margaret fulfilled her dream of opening a small restaurant, though it was more of a bakery, really, attached to the boarding house. She made pies and breads and cakes that people came from all over town to buy. Logan helped her in the early mornings, hauling flour and sugar, fixing broken shelves, doing whatever she needed. He loved watching her work, loved the way her face glowed with satisfaction when a customer praised her cooking. They were happy, genuinely, deeply happy in a way that Logan had thought was impossible for him after Caroline died. The guilt of that happiness sometimes crept up on him late at night. Was he betraying Caroline's memory by loving someone else, by building a new life? But Margaret, perceptive as always, seemed to sense his struggle. "Caroline would want you to be happy," she said one night as they lay in bed together. "I never met her, but from what you have told me about her, she was kind and good. She would not want you to spend the rest of your life alone and grieving. She would want you to live, Logan. To really live." "How did you know what I was thinking?" Logan asked, his arm tightening around her. "Because I know you," Margaret said simply. "And because I have thought the same things about my parents. But then I realized that the best way to honor the people we have lost is to live well, to be happy, to make the most of the time we have been given. That is not betrayal. That is grace." Logan pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her. "I love you," he said, and he would never get tired of saying those words, of meaning them with every fiber of his being. "I love you too," Margaret whispered back. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Margaret told Logan she was pregnant. He stood in their kitchen, staring at her as the words sank in, and then suddenly he was moving, sweeping her up in his arms and spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We are going to have a baby," Logan said, and his voice was full of wonder and a fear he did not quite know how to name. He had lost so much already. What if he lost this too? Margaret seemed to read his thoughts. "Do not be afraid," she said, cupping his face in her hands. "Have faith. Not the kind of faith you lost, but a new kind. Faith in life, in love, in our future together." Logan nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. "I will try," he promised. "That is all anyone can do," Margaret said. As Margaret's belly grew round with their child, Logan found himself constantly amazed by the miracle of it. This tiny person was growing inside his wife, a combination of the two of them, a new life coming into the world. He talked to the baby sometimes when Margaret was asleep, his big hand resting gently on her stomach, speaking in low, quiet tones about all the things he would teach them, all the ways he would protect them and love them. The baby was born on a cold November morning, arriving with a healthy set of lungs and a full head of dark hair. A boy. Logan held his son for the first time and felt something crack wide open in his chest. He looked down at this tiny, perfect human being, and all the words he had hoarded for so many years suddenly felt inadequate to express what he felt. "Hello, Samuel," Margaret said softly from the bed, reaching out to touch the baby's little hand. They had decided on the name weeks ago, after Logan's father. "Welcome to the world." Logan could not speak. He just stared at his son, at this miracle, at this second chance he had been given. Tears ran down his face, soaking into his beard, but he did not wipe them away. He just held Samuel and marveled at the weight of him, the warmth, the realness. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, concerned. Logan looked up at her, at his wife who had given him so much, who had loved him back to life. "I am perfect," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for this, for him, for everything." Margaret smiled tiredly. "We made him together," she said. "You are just as much a part of this miracle as I am." Samuel grew quickly, a healthy, happy baby who seemed to love life with the same enthusiasm as his mother. Logan discovered that fatherhood suited him in ways he had not expected. He loved the feeling of Samuel falling asleep on his chest, loved the weight of his son in his arms, loved the way Samuel's little hand would wrap around his finger with surprising strength. He built things for his son. A cradle first, carved with intricate patterns of mountains and trees. Then toys, wooden animals, and blocks, and a little wagon that Samuel could pull around when he got older. Logan poured all his love into these creations, his hands shaping wood into objects that would hopefully make his son's life better, happier. The years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Samuel learned to walk, then to run, charging through their house and garden with boundless energy. He looked like Logan, everyone said, with his dark hair and strong build, but he had Margaret's smile, warm and open, and he laughed easily and often. When Samuel was 3, Margaret became pregnant again. This time, Logan felt less fear and more excitement. He knew now that life could be good, that love could grow and flourish, that second chances were real. Their daughter was born in the spring, during a thunderstorm that seemed to herald her arrival. She came out screaming, her little face red with outrage, and Logan fell in love with her immediately. They named her Emma, after Margaret's mother. Emma was different from Samuel. Where he was steady and serious, she was wild and impulsive. She climbed everything she could reach, got into everything she was not supposed to touch, and charmed her way out of trouble with a grin that was pure mischief. Logan adored her, though she drove him crazy with her daredevil ways. "She's going to be a handful," Margaret said one evening as they watched 4-year-old Emma try to climb onto the roof of their shed. "I wonder where she gets that from," Logan said, glancing at his wife with a smile. Margaret laughed. "I was never that bad." "You wandered into a blizzard and nearly died," Logan pointed out. "I would say that is pretty close." "That was different," Margaret protested, but she was laughing too. Logan went to retrieve Emma from the shed, swinging her up onto his shoulders, despite her protests that she was fine. She could climb even higher if he just let her. He carried her inside and helped Margaret get both children ready for bed, reading them a story before tucking them in. Later, as he and Margaret sat on their porch watching the stars come out, Logan reflected on how different his life was now from what it had been 8 years ago. Back then, he had been a ghost haunting a mountain cabin, convinced that his life was over, that he had nothing left to live for. Now he had everything. A wife he loved more than he could express, 2 healthy children, a home, a purpose. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, leaning against his shoulder. "How lucky I am," Logan said simply. "How grateful." "We are both lucky," Margaret said. "We found each other when we needed each other most." Logan pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You saved my life, you know. That day you collapsed in the snow outside my cabin. You saved me, just as much as I saved you." "Then we saved each other," Margaret said, "and we will keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." "Yes," Logan agreed, "we will." The years continued to unfold, bringing with them the normal joys and sorrows of life. Samuel grew into a thoughtful, intelligent boy who loved books and learning. Emma remained adventurous and fearless, always ready for the next challenge. Logan and Margaret raised them with love and patience, teaching them the values they held dear: kindness, honesty, hard work, compassion. Logan's construction business grew, and he became known throughout the region as a master builder. People sought him out for important projects, and he took pride in his work, in creating things that would last. But he never worked so much that he missed time with his family. That was the most important thing, the lesson he had learned the hard way. Time was precious, and you could not get it back once it was gone. Margaret's bakery became a fixture in Ordway. People came not just for the delicious food, but for Margaret herself, for her warmth and kindness, and the way she always had a listening ear for anyone who needed it. She had a gift for making people feel seen and valued, and the community loved her for it. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Logan took Margaret back up to the mountain cabin where they had first met. It had taken some arranging, getting Mrs. Henley to watch the children for a few days, but he wanted to do this, wanted to show Margaret where their story had really begun. The cabin was still standing, though it showed signs of neglect. Logan had not been back in years, had not needed to retreat to this place of isolation anymore. But as they approached it now, hand in hand, he felt a wave of nostalgia for the simple life he had lived here, even as he was grateful for the rich, full life he had now. "This is where I found you," Margaret said softly, standing at the spot where she had collapsed all those years ago. "Right here." "Best day of my life," Logan said, and he meant it. They went inside the cabin, and Logan built a fire in the old fireplace. They spent the evening talking, remembering, reflecting on all the ways their lives had changed. Margaret sang some of the hymns she had sung that first week, and Logan listened with his eyes closed, transported back to those early days when everything was uncertain and new. That night, lying in his old narrow cot with Margaret curled against him, Logan spoke words that had been forming in his heart for a long time. "I thought words were useless," he said into the darkness. "After Caroline died, I thought they were empty, meaningless. I thought they could not change anything or fix anything or make anything better. But I was wrong. Words do matter, not because they can prevent loss or stop death or change the things we cannot control, but because they connect us. They let us share our hearts, our thoughts, our love. You taught me that, Margaret. You taught me that words, spoken with honesty and love, are one of the most powerful things we have." Margaret was quiet for a moment, and then Logan felt her tears against his chest. "That might be the most you have spoken at one time since I have known you," she said with a watery laugh. Logan smiled in the darkness. "I have been practicing." "I am glad you found your voice again," Margaret whispered, "but I want you to know I loved you even when you were silent. I loved all of you, even the broken parts." "I know," Logan said. "That is why I was able to heal, because you loved me even when I could not love myself." They returned to Ordway 2 days later, to their children and their life in their home. But Logan felt like something had been completed, some circle closed. He had returned to the place of his greatest isolation and found that it no longer held any power over him. His life was here, in town, with the people he loved. Samuel grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, but with a gentle soul that drew people to him. At 18, he shocked Logan and Margaret by announcing that he wanted to become a doctor. He had always been drawn to helping people, they realized, always been the one to bandage up Emma's scraped knees or take care of injured animals he found. "I am proud of you," Logan told his son. "You have chosen a hard path, but an important one." "You taught me that what matters most is serving others," Samuel said. "You and Mother both. I want to do that in my own way." Emma, at 16, was still trying to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. She loved the outdoors, loved horses and adventure, and had her father's skill with her hands. Logan suspected she would do something unconventional, something that would probably give him and Margaret heart attacks, but he also knew she would be brilliant at whatever she chose. Logan was 50 years old now, his hair graying at the temples, his body still strong but marked by the years of hard work. Margaret was 43, still beautiful, her dark hair streaked with silver. They had been married for 18 years, and Logan loved her more with each passing day. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Emma having gone to a friend's house and Samuel away at school, Margaret said, "Do you ever think about going back? To preaching, I mean." Logan considered the question. "No," he said after a moment. "That life belongs to someone I used to be. I am not that man anymore." "You're still a man of faith," Margaret said. "Maybe not in the way you used to be, but I see it in how you live your life, in how you love us, how you help others, how you find beauty and meaning in everyday things." "That is a different kind of faith," Logan said. "Not faith in sermons or doctrines or easy answers. Just faith that love matters, that kindness matters, that we are all doing the best we can with what we have been given." "I think that is the best kind of faith," Margaret said. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Logan reached over and took Margaret's hand, lacing their fingers together. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For everything. For not giving up on me, for teaching me how to live again, for giving me a reason to remember my own voice." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You would have found your way back eventually," she said. "I just happened to arrive at the right time." "You arrived at exactly the right time," Logan corrected. "Not a moment too soon or too late. You arrived when I needed you most, and I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life." "We were meant to find each other," Margaret said. "I believe that. I believe some things are just meant to be." Logan pulled her close, and they sat together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, two people who had found each other in the wilderness and built a life more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. Years continued to pass, as they always do. Samuel became a respected doctor, working in Ordway and the surrounding areas, bringing healing to people just as he had always wanted. He married a kind schoolteacher named Rachel, and they gave Logan and Margaret 3 grandchildren who filled their lives with joy and chaos. Emma did exactly what Logan had suspected she would do. At 20, she announced she was opening a horse ranch with a business partner, a young woman named Catherine, who shared her love of horses. They built it into a successful operation, breeding and training horses that were sought after throughout Colorado. Emma never married, but she was happy, and that was all Logan cared about. Logan and Margaret grew old together, watching their children and grandchildren thrive, watching Ordway grow and change around them. Logan's hair went completely white, and his body began to slow down, but he never stopped building things. He made furniture for his grandchildren, repaired things around town, stayed active and engaged in his community. Margaret's bakery eventually passed to a young woman she had trained, but she never stopped cooking. Their house always smelled like fresh bread or cookies, and their grandchildren knew they could always find treats at Grandma Margaret's house. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at Logan and Margaret's house for a celebration. Samuel and his family came. Emma and Catherine came. Friends from town came. The house overflowed with people and laughter and love. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had left, Logan and Margaret sat on their porch swing, watching the younger grandchildren chase fireflies in the yard. Emma and Samuel were inside cleaning up, and Logan could hear their voices through the open window, arguing good-naturedly about something he could not quite make out. 40 years, Margaret said, shaking her head in wonder. Where did all that time go? Into this, Logan said, gesturing at the scene before them, the house they had built together, the family they had created, the life they had lived. Every moment, every day, into building something that matters. We did well, did not we? Margaret asked, and there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice that Logan recognized. She was 73 now, and she worried sometimes that she had not accomplished enough, had not been enough. Logan turned to her, taking her face gently in his weathered hands. We did better than well, he said firmly. Look at what we created together. 2 amazing children who are living good lives, grandchildren who are loved and happy, a community we are part of, a love that has sustained us through everything. Margaret, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You are my miracle. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. You are mine too, she whispered, my mountain man who learned to speak again, who learned to love again. They kissed, a soft, gentle kiss full of 40 years of love and partnership and friendship. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. I love you, Logan said, the words as easy and natural as breathing now. "I love you too," Margaret replied, "always and forever." They sat together on the porch swing, gently rocking back and forth, watching the fireflies and the grandchildren and the stars emerging in the darkening sky. And Logan thought about the man he had been, the man who had climbed into the mountains and sworn never to speak again. That man would not have believed that life could be this good, that love could be this deep, that healing was even possible. But Margaret had taught him otherwise. She had arrived in his life like a gift from grace, and she had shown him that words still mattered, that love still mattered, that life still mattered. She had saved him from his self-imposed exile and given him a reason to remember his own voice. And he had spent every day since trying to be worthy of that gift, trying to build a life that honored her faith in him, trying to love her as completely as she had loved him. As the evening grew darker and cooler, they finally went inside, Logan's arm around Margaret's waist, her head resting against his shoulder. Their children and grandchildren were gathered in the living room, talking and laughing, and Logan and Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching, just soaking in the beautiful ordinariness of it all. This was what mattered. Not sermons or grand gestures or profound words. Just this: family, love, presence, connection. The simple, powerful act of showing up for each other, day after day, year after year. Logan had not spoken to a soul in 5 years when Margaret arrived, and he remembered his own voice. But what he had really remembered was how to be human, how to be connected, how to be alive. And for that, for her, for all of this, he would be grateful until his last breath. He pulled Margaret closer and pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and she smiled up at him with those green eyes that still took his breath away. "Come on," she said, tugging him into the room. "Your family is waiting." "Our family," Logan corrected, and hand in hand, they joined the people they loved most in the world, stepping into the warmth and light and love they had built together from the ashes of grief and the gift of second chances.